They whispered she was just a diversity hire who'd never survived the Navy's most elite pilot program. 6 months later, she was rewriting the tactical manual that every Top Gun graduate would study for the next decade. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The morning briefing room at Naval Fighter Weapons School hummed with testosterone and jet fuel confidence. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Phoenix Martinez stood near the back wall, her flight suit regulation perfect, but somehow different from the others. Where the male pilots wore their suits with casual arrogance, hers seemed deliberately pressed, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. Her name tag read simply Martinez S, with wings that gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but missing the collection of squadron patches that adorned every other pilot in the room around her. 24 of the Navy's finest aviators filled metal folding chairs arranged in precise rows. Call signs like Maverick, Iceman, and Hollywood were stitched onto shoulders and painted on helmet bags. These men had earned their spots through years of carrier deployments, combat missions, and aerial victories that made headlines. Sarah had earned hers through a recommendation letter that half the base assumed was written to fill a quota. The instructor, Commander Jake Viper Thompson, strode to the front with the swagger of someone who'd shot down 3 enemy aircraft before. His 30th birthday. His aviator sunglasses hung from a cord around his neck, and his khaki uniform bore ribbons that told stories of air campaigns across 3 continents. Behind him, a massive screen displayed the Miramar airspace sectioned into training zones. That would become as familiar as their own backyards over the next 12 weeks. "Welcome to Top Gun," Viper announced, his voice carrying the crisp authority of command. "You're here because you're the best of the best. Each of you has demonstrated exceptional skill in air-to-air combat, superior flying ability, and tactical innovation." He paused, scanning the room with eyes that had seen more aerial combat than most pilots could imagine. "Over the next 12 weeks, we'll separate the good pilots from the great ones." Sarah listened from her position against the wall, noting how Viper's gaze seemed to skip over her entirely. It wasn't intentional malice, she realized, but something worse: unconscious dismissal. In his mental catalog of potential champions, she simply didn't register as a serious contender. The pilot introductions began with typical military efficiency. Lieutenant Razor Williams from VFA 31, 6 air-to-air kills over the Persian Gulf. Lieutenant Commander Blade Johnson from VFA 143, top graduate from his strike fighter training class. Lieutenant Thunder Peterson from VFA 87, youngest pilot ever to achieve weapons employment certification on the FA-18 Super Hornet. Each man stood when called, receiving nods of acknowledgement from peers who recognized the significance of their accomplishments. The room felt like a gathering of warriors, each one accustomed to being the best pilot on whatever ship or base they'd called home. When Viper reached the final name on his roster, his tone shifted almost imperceptibly. "Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez, VFA-195. The pause that followed lasted barely 2 seconds, but in a room full of competitive pilots, silence spoke volumes. Previously deployed with Marine Air-Ground Task Force operations in Afghanistan. Sarah stood slowly, feeling 24 pairs of eyes evaluate her like she was an aircraft they couldn't quite identify. At 5'6", she was smaller than every other pilot in the room, but her posture carried the rigid confidence of someone who'd spent 8 years proving herself in combat zones where hesitation meant death. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, revealing a face that was attractive but serious, with brown eyes that seemed to calculate angles and distances, even while standing still. "Marine background," someone whispered from the 3rd row, just loud enough for several people to hear. The comment carried no obvious malice, but the inflection suggested something was out of place. Navy pilots and Marine aviators shared the same aircraft and similar training, but their cultures remained distinctly different. Marines were known for close air support and ground attack missions, while Navy pilots specialized in fleet defense and air superiority. As Sarah sat back down, she caught fragments of conversations that weren't meant for her ears. First female pilot they've sent here in 2 years, murmured Lieutenant Peterson to the pilot beside him. Wonder how she got recommended. The speculation continued in undertones while Viper outlined the training schedule. Classroom instruction on advanced tactics, simulator sessions on weapons employment, and daily flight operations that would test every skill they developed throughout their careers. The graduation rate hovered around 60%, meaning that nearly half the pilots in this room would wash out before receiving the Top Gun certificate that marked them as elite weapons instructors. Your performance here determines not just your own career trajectory, Viper continued, but your ability to train the next generation of naval aviators. Top Gun graduates return to their squadrons as subject matter experts, responsible for developing tactical doctrine and instructing junior pilots. The knowledge you gain here multiplies across the entire fleet. Sarah absorbed every word while simultaneously cataloging the subtle dynamics around her. The way pilots from the same carrier air wings clustered together. The casual confidence of officers who'd never had their presence questioned. The assumption that everyone in this room belonged here without caveat or explanation. During the coffee break that followed, small groups formed naturally around shared experiences and mutual recognition. Conversations flowed about mutual acquaintances, memorable deployments, and aircraft carrier tales that bonded Navy pilots like membership in an exclusive club. Sarah found herself standing alone near the coffee station, invisible despite being the only person in the room who looked different from the others. Lieutenant Williams approached the coffee pot just as Sarah was stirring cream into her cup. He was tall and blond with the kind of easy smile that probably made him popular at officer club gatherings. "So Martinez," he said with forced casualness. "Marine Corps, huh? How'd you end up in Navy fighters?" The question seemed innocent enough, but Sarah recognized the subtext. Marine pilots typically flew Harriers or older model Hornets, focusing on close air support rather than air-to-air combat. Her transition to Super Hornets and eventual Top Gun selection represented an unusual career path that invited scrutiny. "Joint service assignment," she replied evenly. "Spent 2 years with VFA 195 before getting selected for the program." Williams nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he was working through calculations that didn't quite add up. "Must have been some assignment. I heard they're really pushing for more diversity in the program these days." The comment hung in the air like smoke from a controlled burn. Not quite an accusation, but close enough to make his meaning clear. Sarah kept her expression neutral, a skill she'd perfected through years of similar conversations. "I'm here for the same reason you are," she said quietly. "To become a better pilot." As Williams walked away, Sarah remained by the coffee station, watching the easy camaraderie that flowed around her like water around a stone. These men shared something she couldn't quite access, the assumption that their presence required no justification. They were here because they were obviously qualified, their skills self-evident to anyone who mattered. But Sarah carried something they couldn't see, knowledge earned through combat deployments that had taught her lessons no training manual covered. 8 years of flying close air support missions in Afghanistan, where split-second decisions meant the difference between protecting ground troops and becoming a casualty statistic. Experience with aircraft systems pushed beyond their design limits by combat necessity. Understanding of tactical innovation born from desperation rather than doctrine. The morning briefing concluded with assignment of call signs, a tradition that marked acceptance into the Top Gun Brotherhood. Viper read through the list with ceremonial gravity, each name representing hours of discussion among the instructor staff. Razor Williams became sharpshooter for his precision gunnery scores. Thunder Peterson earned Lightning for his aggressive flying style. When Viper reached Sarah's name, he paused longer than he had for anyone else. "Martinez," he announced finally. "Your call sign is Phoenix." The name carried layers of meaning that weren't lost on anyone in the room. The mythical bird that rose from ashes, reborn and renewed. For a pilot transitioning from Marine Corps to Navy, from ground support to air superiority, the symbolism was deliberate. But Sarah understood something the instructors hadn't intended. Phoenix wasn't just about rising from ashes. It was about surviving what would have destroyed others, emerging stronger from trials that lesser pilots couldn't endure. As she walked out of the briefing room into the brilliant California sunshine, she carried that understanding like ammunition she'd saved for when it mattered most. The whispers followed her across the tarmac toward the flight line, where 24 FA-18 Super Hornets waited in perfect formation. Tomorrow, the real testing would begin. Sarah's quarters at Miramar felt like a monk's cell compared to the spacious staterooms she'd grown accustomed to during carrier deployments. A narrow bed, metal desk, and wall locker barely left room to stand, but the Spartan environment suited her perfectly. While other pilots headed to the officers' club for drinks and war stories, she spread 3 thick binders across her desk under the harsh glow of a fluorescent lamp. The first binder contained declassified after-action reports from Marine Corps, close air support missions dating back to Vietnam. Pages yellow with age-documented tactics that predated precision-guided munitions and fly-by-wire flight controls. Hand-drawn diagrams showed attack profiles developed by pilots who flew A-4 Skyhawks into surface-to-air missile envelopes without electronic countermeasures. Sarah had requested these files from the Marine Corps' Historical Division, paying for photocopying costs out of her own pocket because she believed combat wisdom transcended technological generations. Her second binder held maintenance manuals for aircraft systems that Top Gun instructors considered obsolete, manual backup procedures for fly-by-wire failures, emergency engine restart sequences for situations beyond normal training scenarios, hydraulic system failures that could cripple an aircraft's maneuverability unless the pilot understood how to compensate using techniques that weren't taught in modern flight schools. These procedures had saved her life twice during her Afghanistan deployment, when equipment failures over hostile territory left her with choices between death and innovation. The third binder was her masterpiece, a collection of tactical innovations developed by pilots who'd fought in conflicts the current generation of aviators knew only from history books. Israeli Air Force techniques from the Yom Kippur War, Royal Air Force night attack profiles from the Falklands, Soviet pilot manuals captured during the Cold War and translated by Defense Intelligence Agency analysts who understood that enemy tactics often contained lessons worth learning. Sarah opened the Israeli binder to a section marked with a red tab. The pages described a technique called vertical maneuver enhancement, developed during air battles over the Sinai Peninsula in 1973. Israeli pilots discovered that F-4 Phantoms could outmaneuver more agile MiG-21s by using aggressive vertical climbs that exploited the Soviet aircraft's engine limitations. The tactic required precise timing and complete understanding of both aircraft's performance envelopes, but it had turned inevitable defeats into decisive victories. Modern Top Gun doctrine discouraged such aggressive maneuvering, favoring beyond visual range missile engagements and sophisticated radar tactics. Current FA-18 Super Hornets possess sensor capabilities that Israeli pilots couldn't have imagined. But Sarah understood that technology could fail. When stealth failed, when electronic warfare jammed radar systems, when sophisticated weapons malfunctioned, the fundamental physics of aerial combat remained unchanged. She traced her finger along a diagram showing climb angles and energy management techniques that maximized an aircraft's vertical performance. The math was complex, requiring calculations that modern flight computers handled automatically. But Sarah had taught herself to perform these computations manually during her Marine Corps deployment. When digital systems failed over Afghanistan, she'd relied on mental arithmetic and instinctive understanding of aircraft performance to survive situations that would have killed pilots dependent on computer assistance. A soft knock interrupted her concentration. Sarah glanced at her watch. 2,230 hours. Late for social visits, early for emergency briefings. She opened the door to find Lieutenant Jennifer Siren Kim standing in the hallway, looking uncomfortable in civilian clothes that seemed foreign. After 8 years of military uniforms. "Phoenix," Siren said quietly. "Mind if I come in? I wanted to talk." Sarah stepped aside, noting how Kim's eyes immediately focused on the binders spread across her desk. Siren was one of only 2 other female pilots at Miramar, a weapons systems officer rather than a pilot, but still part of the exclusive fraternity that flew Navy fighters. Her reputation for electronic warfare expertise had earned grudging respect from male pilots who typically dismissed backseaters as glorified computer operators. "What are you studying?" Siren asked, approaching the desk with obvious curiosity. "Old combat reports," Sarah replied, closing the Israeli binder. "Tactics from pilots who fought before we had all this digital equipment." Siren picked up one of the Vietnam-era documents, scanning pages filled with technical diagrams and handwritten notes. "Why, these techniques are ancient history. Modern aircraft don't fight like this anymore." The question carried no judgment, only genuine puzzlement. Sarah had heard similar reactions from every pilot she'd tried to discuss historical tactics with during her career. The assumption was always the same: newer meant better, and anything developed before computer-assisted flight controls was automatically obsolete, because combat doesn't always go according to plan, Sarah explained, settling into her desk chair. Equipment fails, electronic warfare disrupts systems. Weather interferes with sensors. When that happens, you need to understand the fundamentals. Siren continued reading, her expression shifting from curiosity to concentration. "This diagram shows energy management techniques I've never seen before. Where did you learn this stuff?" "Afghanistan," Sarah said simply. 8 years of close air support missions where failure meant dead Marines on the ground. You learn to use every advantage available. The conversation that followed revealed more than Sarah had intended to share. Siren listened intently as Sarah described combat situations where textbook solutions had failed, forcing her to improvise using techniques she'd discovered in historical research. Flying damaged aircraft back to base using manual flight controls. Defeating surface-to-air missiles through aggressive maneuvering that exceeded published aircraft limitations. Coordinating with ground forces using radio procedures that hadn't been updated since the Korean War. "The instructors here don't know about any of this," Siren observed, flipping through pages of tactical diagrams. "They're all carrier pilots focused on fleet defense and air superiority missions. This ground support experience is completely different." "Different enough that they don't see its value," Sarah agreed. "They assume Marine Corps' tactics are primitive compared to Navy sophistication." Siren found a page showing attack profiles for defeating radar-guided missiles through terrain masking and chaff deployment. The techniques required flying at altitudes and speeds that modern safety regulations discouraged, but they'd proven effective against Soviet-era surface-to-air missile systems, still deployed throughout the Middle East. "Have you tried showing this to any of the instructors?" Siren asked. Sarah's laugh carried no humor. "Commander Thompson made it clear during our first one-on-one briefing that he expected me to focus on learning Navy procedures rather than sharing Marine Corps' innovations." He used air quotes when he said innovations. The dismissal wasn't unique to Top Gun. Throughout her career, Sarah had encountered pilots who assumed that any tactic they hadn't learned in flight school was automatically inferior. The Navy's emphasis on standardized procedures and technological superiority created an institutional blind spot regarding combat adaptations developed outside their formal training pipeline. But Sarah's research had convinced her that the most effective pilots throughout history were those who understood both modern capabilities and fundamental principles. The Red Baron's energy management techniques remained valid in the jet age. Chuck Yeager's test pilot mentality of pushing aircraft beyond their published limitations had applications in modern combat. Israeli pilots' innovative use of terrain and weather conditions could be adapted to contemporary warfare scenarios. Siren spent another hour examining Sarah's collection, asking questions that revealed both intelligence and tactical sophistication. Unlike the male pilots who dismissed her research as historical curiosity, Siren recognized the potential applications of techniques that predated computer-assisted warfare. "This could revolutionize how we think about air combat," Siren said. Finally, these energy management principles, the vertical maneuvering techniques, the manual calculation methods, they're like having backup systems for situations where technology fails. "Exactly," Sarah replied. "But try explaining that to pilots who've never had their computers crash in a combat zone." As Siren prepared to leave, she turned back with an expression Sarah couldn't quite interpret. "Phoenix, be careful how you use this knowledge. Some of the instructors here see innovation as insubordination. They want graduates who'll implement Navy doctrine, not pilots who challenge established procedures." After Siren left, Sarah returned to her binders with renewed focus. Tomorrow would bring their first air-to-air training flight, where 24 elite pilots would demonstrate the skills that had earned them Top Gun selection. The instructors expected her to struggle, to prove that her selection had been a mistake corrected by competitive pressure. But Sarah carried 8 years of combat experience that none of her classmates possessed. She understood aircraft performance, envelopes that weren't published in technical manuals. She'd mastered energy management techniques that computer systems couldn't replicate. Most importantly, she'd learned to think beyond the limitations of standardized doctrine when survival demanded innovation. The other pilots would fly according to procedures they'd memorized at the Naval Academy and refined through years of carrier operations. Sarah would fly using instincts sharpened by combat and knowledge preserved from pilots who'd faced death with inferior equipment and superior determination. She opened the Vietnam binder to a section describing close-range maneuvering, tactics developed by pilots flying F-4 Phantoms against more agile North Vietnamese MiGs. The techniques violated several modern safety regulations, but they'd proven effective when sophisticated missiles failed in combat, devolved to guns-only engagements that tested pilot skill rather than technological superiority. Tomorrow she would begin showing her classmates that the oldest lessons were often the most important ones. The first flight briefing began at 0530 hours in a windowless room that smelled of stale coffee and aviation fuel. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early, finding the chairs arranged in a horseshoe pattern, facing a large tactical display screen. She chose a seat in the second row, close enough to see details but not so forward as to appear overeager. The morning light streaming through the single high window cast geometric shadows across tactical charts covering every wall. Commander Thompson entered with the theatrical presence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. His flight suit bore patches from 3 different carrier air wings, each one representing deployments where he'd established his reputation as both an exceptional pilot and an uncompromising instructor. Behind him walked Lieutenant Commander Jester Harrison, the Top Gun academic instructor whose Ph.D. in aeronautical engineering made him the school's authority on theoretical combat dynamics. "Today we begin with basic fighter maneuvering," Thompson announced, his laser pointer dancing across a diagram showing aircraft positions and attack vectors. "BFM is the foundation of everything we do here. Master these fundamentals, and advanced tactics become possible. Fail here, and nothing else matters. The other pilots listened with the focused attention of students who understood that careers could be made or destroyed in this room. Sarah noticed how they sat forward slightly, pens ready, eyes tracking Thompson's every gesture like radar locks. On a target. These men had spent years preparing for this moment, studying every manual and memorizing every procedure that might give them an advantage. Thompson clicked to the next slide, showing energy management principles that governed aerial combat. Modern BFM relies on situational awareness provided by advanced radar systems and data link communications. Your aircraft's computers calculate optimal attack angles, manage engine performance, and provide tactical recommendations in real time. Trust your systems, follow established procedures, and execute with precision. Lieutenant Sharpshooter Williams raised his hand. Sir, what about situations where electronic warfare disrupts our systems? How do we maintain tactical advantage without computer assistance? Thompson's smile carried the patient condescension of someone explaining basic concepts to a slow student. Sharpshooter, if you're close enough for electronic warfare to affect your systems, you've already made tactical errors. Modern air combat occurs at beyond visual range distances using precision missiles guided by satellite navigation. The days of close-range dogfighting ended with the Cold War. Sarah felt her jaw clench involuntarily. She'd experienced electronic warfare jamming during 17 different combat missions over Afghanistan, where enemy forces used Soviet-era equipment to disrupt NATO communications and navigation systems. The idea that modern warfare had eliminated close-range combat contradicted 8 years of direct experience, but she remained silent. Jester took over the presentation, launching into a detailed explanation of FA-18 Super Hornet performance. Characteristics: maximum G-force tolerances, optimal climb rates, fuel consumption patterns during various combat maneuvers. The data was technically accurate, but sterile, like reading specifications from an aircraft manual rather than understanding how the machine behaved when pushed beyond published limitations. The Super Hornet's fly-by-wire system prevents pilots from exceeding aircraft design parameters, Jester explained. Computer-controlled flight surfaces maintain optimal performance automatically, eliminating human error that plagued earlier generation fighters. Simply put, the aircraft is smarter than any pilot. Lieutenant Lightning Peterson nodded enthusiastically. So we focus on systems management rather than stick and rudder skills? Exactly, Thompson interjected. Modern fighters are weapons platforms, not aerobatic performers. Your job is to employ sensors and weapons efficiently, not to engage in World War II-style aerial combat. Sarah's hand moved halfway toward raising position before she caught herself. Every instinct screamed to challenge the assertion that computers could replace pilot intuition, but she'd learned to pick her battles carefully. Instead, she made a note in her flight manual, verified G-force limitations through practical testing. The briefing continued with weapons employment procedures that emphasized beyond visual range, missile shots and radar-guided attacks. Thompson displayed engagement scenarios where American fighters destroyed enemy aircraft from distances exceeding 30 miles, never allowing opponents close enough for traditional dogfighting. The tactics were sophisticated and effective, assuming perfect electronic conditions and unlimited missile supplies. During the coffee break that followed, Sarah approached Jester near the tactical display. Sir, I noticed the briefing focused on long-range engagement scenarios. Are there training flights that cover close-range maneuvering situations? Jester's expression shifted from neutral professionalism to mild irritation. Phoenix, I understand. You're coming from a Marine Corps background where close air support requires different tactics. But Navy fighter doctrine has evolved beyond the primitive maneuvering techniques used for ground attack missions. The word primitive hit Sarah like a physical blow. 8 years of combat experience reduced to a dismissive adjective by someone whose entire career had been spent in training environments where failure meant embarrassment rather than death. I was thinking more about backup procedures, Sarah persisted. Situations where long-range systems fail and pilots need to rely on basic maneuvering skills. Phoenix, Jester's tone carried the forced patience of someone explaining concepts to a child. If you're worried about system failures, perhaps you should request additional technical training on Super Hornet reliability statistics. These aircraft are engineered to prevent the scenarios you're describing. Lieutenant Williams appeared beside them, coffee cup in hand and expression suggesting he'd overheard enough to form opinions. Jester's right, Phoenix. We're not flying crop dusters here. These jets are billion-dollar weapon systems with redundant backups for every critical component. Besides, added Lieutenant Commander Blade Johnson, who'd approached from the Kosfa other direction, the Marines have different mission requirements. Navy fighters protect the fleet from advanced threats, not Taliban fighters hiding in caves. The comment drew chuckles from several nearby pilots who'd apparently been monitoring the conversation. Sarah recognized the dynamic immediately, the pack mentality that emerged when military professionals encountered someone who challenged established assumptions. She'd seen it before during joint operations where different services worked together, but maintained distinct tribal identities. Of course, Sarah replied evenly. I'm here to learn Navy procedures. But as the group dispersed, she caught fragments of conversation that weren't meant for her ears. Marine mentality, someone murmured. Still thinking like a ground pounder. Another voice added, give her a few weeks. She figure out this isn't Afghanistan. Thompson called the group back to order for the practical portion of the briefing. Using a detailed cockpit simulator, he demonstrated proper procedures for various combat scenarios. His hands moved across switches and displays with practiced efficiency, explaining each decision with reference to technical manuals and established doctrine. Situational awareness begins with proper systems management, he explained while manipulating radar controls. Trust your instruments, follow checklist procedures, and maintain communication with supporting aircraft. Individual heroics are obsolete in modern warfare. Sarah watched carefully, noting how Thompson's techniques emphasized technological solutions over pilot instinct. His approaches were methodical and safe, designed to minimize risk through adherence to proven procedures. Nothing he demonstrated was incorrect, but everything assumed optimal conditions where equipment functioned perfectly and enemies behaved predictably. When Thompson asked for questions, Lieutenant Thunder Peterson raised his hand. Sir, what about the stories we hear from older pilots? Guys who fought in Vietnam or Desert Storm using techniques that aren't in current manuals? Thompson's smile carried the weary tolerance of someone who'd answered this question many times. Before Thunder, those pilots flew inferior aircraft against less sophisticated opponents. Modern warfare requires modern solutions. We honor their service by improving upon their methods, not by repeating their mistakes. Sarah felt heat rising in her chest but kept her expression neutral. The dismissal of combat veterans' experience reflected an institutional arrogance that valued theoretical perfection over practical wisdom. She'd met pilots who'd survived scenarios that would have killed aviators trained only in controlled environments, but their knowledge was being systematically eliminated from official doctrine. As the morning briefing concluded, Thompson approached her with an expression that might have been concern or curiosity. Phoenix, I want to be clear about expectations. Top Gun teaches advanced Navy fighter tactics, not Marine Corps' ground support procedures. I need to know you're committed to learning our methods rather than promoting alternative approaches. The warning was delivered with professional courtesy, but its meaning was unmistakable. Conform or fail. Accept Navy doctrine, without question, or find yourself eliminated from the program with recommendations that would effectively end her fighter pilot career. Understood, sir, Sarah replied. "I'm here to learn." But as she walked toward the flight line for their first airborne training mission, Sarah carried with her the quiet determination of someone who'd learned that survival sometimes required thinking beyond the limitations of institutional wisdom. The other pilots would fly exactly as they'd been taught, following procedures developed in committee rooms by people who'd never faced the chaos of actual combat. Sarah would fly as she'd been trained by 8 years of missions where creativity meant the difference between completing the objective and becoming a casualty statistic. Today, she would begin showing them the difference between flying by the book and flying to win. The flight line at Miramar stretched endlessly under the Keon, California sun, with 24 FA-18 Super Hornets arranged in perfect formation like metallic birds of prey. Sarah walked her pre-flight inspection with methodical precision, checking control surfaces, weapon pylons, and engine intakes with the thoroughness of someone who'd learned that mechanical failure over hostile territory was a death sentence. Disguised as statistical probability, Aircraft 304 was assigned to her for the duration of Top Gun training, a gleaming example of American engineering that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. The Super Hornet's twin engines could push the aircraft beyond Mach 1.8, while its radar systems could track multiple targets simultaneously at distances exceeding 100 miles. Every switch, display, and control surface represented years of technological development designed to give American pilots decisive advantages over any potential adversary. But Sarah's pre-flight inspection included checks that weren't in the standard procedure manual. She examined the manual reversion controls that would activate if the fly-by-wire system failed. She tested the backup attitude indicator that would provide flight information if the primary displays malfunctioned. Most importantly, she reviewed the emergency procedures card that outlined steps for flying the aircraft without computer assistance, something that modern pilots rarely practiced but combat veterans understood might save their lives. "Commander," Thompson's voice crackled through the flight line speakers, calling pilots to their final briefing before the first training mission. The assignment was deceptively simple: basic fighter maneuvering exercises designed to evaluate each pilot's fundamental skills. Pairs of aircraft would engage in simulated combat, with instructors monitoring performance from chase planes equipped with sophisticated recording equipment. Sarah's partner for the exercise was Lieutenant Sharpshooter Williams, the confident blonde pilot who'd questioned her qualifications during the coffee break. Williams had graduated first in his class from the Naval Academy and earned his call sign through exceptional gunnery scores during fleet training. His record showed consistent excellence in every aspect of Navy fighter training, making him the type of pilot that instructors expected to dominate Top Gun exercises. The pre-flight briefing took place in a cramped ready room adjacent to the flight line, where both pilots reviewed engagement parameters and safety procedures. Williams spread navigation charts across a metal table, pointing to the designated training area located 50 miles east of Miramar, over the Mojave Desert. "Standard BFM setup," Williams explained with the casual confidence of someone who'd flown similar exercises dozens of times. "We'll start at 30,000 feet, separated by 10 miles. On instructor command, we'll turn toward each other and begin the engagement. First pilot to achieve a simulated missile lock for 3 seconds wins the round." Sarah nodded, studying the charts while mentally calculating fuel consumption rates and performance parameters that would influence their aerial battle. The training area offered unlimited visibility and smooth air conditions, ideal for demonstrating the sophisticated tactics that Top Gun instructors wanted to evaluate. But Sarah's combat experience had taught her that ideal conditions rarely existed in the real world. Weather changed without warning. Equipment malfunctioned at critical moments. Enemies didn't follow predictable patterns established in training scenarios. The most valuable lessons came from situations where standard Procedures failed, and pilots had to improvise using fundamental skills that couldn't be programmed into computers. "What's the backup plan if weather moves into the training area?" Sarah asked, pointing to a meteorological report showing thunderstorms developing over the desert. Williams glanced at the weather data dismissively. "Flight operations will monitor conditions and abort the exercise if necessary. These jets have weather radar that can detect storms from 50 miles away. We'll never get close enough for weather to be a factor." The answer reflected the institutional confidence that Sarah had encountered throughout her Top Gun experience. Modern technology was assumed to provide solutions for every conceivable problem, eliminating the need for contingency planning or adaptive thinking. It was the mentality of pilots who'd never flown through weather that jammed radar systems or encountered equipment failures that left them dependent on instruments that predated digital displays. 30 minutes later, Sarah strapped into the cockpit of Aircraft 304 while ground crews performed final checks on weapon systems and communication equipment. The familiar ritual of engine start and systems activation felt like putting on armor, each switch and display bringing the aircraft to life under her control. But today's mission would be different from the countless training flights she'd flown. During her Navy career, for the first time since arriving at Top Gun, Sarah would be evaluated not on her ability to memorize procedures or follow instructions, but on her skill as a combat pilot. The artificial constraints of classroom instruction would give way to the fundamental test of aerial warfare: who could outfly, outthink, and outfight their opponent when both pilots had access to identical equipment and training. The taxi to the runway passed in radio silence, with Williams leading the formation according to standard procedures. Sarah followed at the prescribed distance, running through mental checklists that covered both normal operations and emergency procedures that most pilots never expected to use. Her combat experience had taught her that the difference between surviving and dying often came down to knowledge that seemed irrelevant until the moment it became essential. Tower cleared them for takeoff with the routine efficiency of controllers who'd launched thousands of similar training missions. Sarah felt the familiar surge of acceleration as her engines reached military power, pushing the Super Hornet down the runway until airspeed indicators showed rotation velocity. The aircraft lifted off smoothly, climbing through clear desert air toward the training area where her skills would be tested, against a pilot who'd never doubted his right to be there. But as they climbed through 15,000 feet, Sarah noticed something that Williams had apparently missed. The weather reports predicted thunderstorms were developing faster than forecast, with towering cumulus clouds building along their planned route. The radar returns showed scattered precipitation that would interfere with sensor performance and create visibility problems that computer systems couldn't solve. "Sharpshooter Phoenix," Sarah called over the radio. "Are you seeing the weather development ahead?" Williams' reply carried the dismissive tone of someone who'd never learned to worry about factors beyond his control. "Phoenix, we've got onboard radar and GPS navigation. Weather won't be a factor for this exercise." The response confirmed Sarah's growing suspicion that her fellow pilots had never learned to operate effectively when technology failed or conditions deviated from training scenarios. They'd been taught to rely on systems that worked perfectly in controlled environments, but combat experience had shown Sarah that perfection was a luxury that pilots couldn't afford to expect as they approached the training area. The scattered clouds began merging into a weather system that would challenge even the most sophisticated aircraft systems. Visibility dropped from unlimited to less than 5 miles, while turbulence increased to levels that would affect aircraft handling and weapons employment. The ideal conditions that instructors had planned for their evaluation were disappearing rapidly, replaced by environmental factors that would test pilot skills rather than technological capabilities. "Commander," Thompson's voice crackled through their headsets from the chase plane monitoring their exercise. "Phoenix, Sharpshooter, be advised weather is moving into the training area. We'll continue with the exercise unless conditions deteriorate further. Sarah recognized the institutional reluctance to abort a training mission because of factors that computer systems were supposedly designed to handle. Thompson's decision reflected the same confidence in technology that had characterized every aspect of Top Gun instruction, the assumption that modern aircraft could overcome any environmental challenge through superior engineering. But Sarah's radar display showed precipitation returns that would interfere with target acquisition, while her aircraft was already experiencing turbulence that affected weapons tracking accuracy. The conditions were rapidly approaching the point where tactical engagement would become less about precision systems employment and more about fundamental flying skills that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. Williams seemed oblivious to the deteriorating conditions, his radio transmissions reflecting the casual confidence of someone who'd never been forced to adapt when circumstances exceeded the parameters of training scenarios. Sarah understood that she was about to face a test that would reveal whether her unconventional knowledge could overcome the institutional assumptions that had shaped every aspect of her Top Gun experience. The weather was about to provide the kind of challenge that couldn't be solved by following established procedures or trusting computer systems to provide optimal solutions. In minutes, both pilots would discover who really understood the fundamentals of aerial combat when technology failed and survival depended on skills that couldn't be programmed into the most sophisticated aircraft ever built. Phoenix, sharpshooter. Take your positions for BFM Exercise 1. Thompson's voice cut through the static as both aircraft maneuvered to their starting points 30 miles apart. Sarah banked left toward her assigned heading, feeling the Super Hornet respond smoothly despite the increasing turbulence that was making the aircraft work harder to maintain stable flight. Through her heads-up display, Sarah could see Williams' aircraft as a small dot against the darkening sky, positioned exactly where the briefing had specified. The textbook setup called for both pilots to turn toward each other on Thompson's command, accelerating to combat speed until one achieved a weapons lock that would end the exercise. Standard Navy doctrine emphasized maintaining maximum sensor range while employing beyond visual range missiles before the opponent could react. Sarah's radar display showed something that changed everything. The weather system moving through the training area was generating electromagnetic interference that degraded sensor performance at exactly the ranges where Williams would expect to dominate. Her 8 years of combat experience had taught her to recognize when conditions favored different tactics than those prescribed in training manuals. Commence BFM exercise. Thompson commanded from his chase plane position several miles away. Williams immediately turned toward Sarah's position while climbing to gain the altitude advantage that Navy doctrine considered essential for long range engagement. His aircraft's radar signature appeared on Sarah's threat warning system as he activated weapon sensors. Following the aggressive tactics that had made him successful throughout his Navy career, Sarah's response would have puzzled any instructor watching from the chase plane. Instead of climbing to match Williams' altitude, she descended toward the deck while turning to an intercept heading that would close the distance between them rapidly. The maneuver violated standard, beyond visual range engagement doctrine, but Sarah understood something that Williams hadn't recognized. The weather conditions had eliminated his technological advantages. "Phoenix, what are you doing?" Williams' voice carried confusion mixed with concern. "You're supposed to maintain separation and employ at maximum range." But Sarah's radar display showed that Williams' sensors were being degraded by the same electromagnetic interference that was affecting her own systems. The precipitation returns from the thunderstorm cells were masking aircraft signatures at precisely the ranges where modern BFM tactics assumed pilots would engage. Williams was trying to fight according to procedures that required perfect sensor performance, while Sarah was adapting to conditions that favored close-range maneuvering. Sarah's descent took her below the worst of the weather interference, where ground clutter provided additional masking for her approach. The technique came from Israeli Air Force manuals she'd studied, developed during conflicts where pilots had learned to exploit terrain and weather conditions that degraded enemy radar performance. Williams' aircraft remained visible on her display, but his sensors were struggling to maintain a clear picture of her position. At 15 miles separation, Williams fired his first simulated missile, following doctrine that called for engaging at maximum range before the opponent could react. But the shot parameters were compromised by weather interference that affected both target tracking and missile guidance. Sarah's threat warning system detected the launch, but her evasive maneuver was unlike anything taught in current Navy training. She rolled inverted and pulled the aircraft into a dive that exceeded published G-force recommendations, using vertical maneuvering techniques that predated computer-assisted flight controls. The maneuver combined energy management principles from World War II fighter tactics with modern aircraft capabilities, creating a flight path that confused Williams' tracking systems while positioning Sarah for a counterattack. "Phoenix, you're exceeding aircraft limitations," Williams warned over the radio. "Pull out of that dive before you overstress the airframe." But Sarah understood her aircraft's real capabilities better than the conservative parameters published in technical manuals. Her combat experience had taught her that Super Hornets could handle stresses that exceeded peacetime training limitations when pilot survival depended on maximum performance. The fly-by-wire system would prevent actual structural damage while allowing her to exploit the aircraft's full potential. Williams' second missile shot came as Sarah pulled out of her dive in a climbing turn that brought her within visual range despite the reduced visibility. The close-range engagement scenario that Navy doctrine considered obsolete was exactly what Sarah had been preparing for through her historical research. She could see Williams' aircraft clearly now, its position predictable because he was following standard intercept procedures. Sarah's counterattack used energy management techniques that hadn't been taught at Top Gun in 20 years. Instead of trying to achieve a head-on missile shot, she maneuvered to force Williams into a defensive spiral that would exhaust his aircraft's energy reserves while preserving her own. The tactic required precise timing and intuitive understanding of both aircraft's performance characteristics, knowledge that couldn't be programmed into computer systems. How is she doing that? Williams' voice carried frustration as he found himself forced into increasingly desperate maneuvers to avoid Sarah's simulated weapons locks. Thompson's chase plane had been following the engagement from a distance, recording every aspect of the combat for later analysis. His radio transmission reflected the confusion of an instructor watching tactics that didn't match established doctrine. "Phoenix, explain your maneuvering strategy. You're not following standard BFM procedures." Sarah's response came while she maintained pressure on Williams, forcing him into a defensive position that eliminated his advantages in aircraft performance and weapon systems. "Sir, I'm adapting to weather conditions that degrade sensor performance. Close-range maneuvering is more effective when beyond visual range systems are compromised." The explanation was technically accurate but incomplete. Sarah was actually demonstrating combat techniques that she'd learned from pilots who'd fought in conflicts where sophisticated weapons had failed and survival depended on fundamental flying skills. Her maneuvers combined historical tactics with modern aircraft capabilities, creating approaches that current Navy doctrine didn't recognize. Williams attempted to regain the initiative by climbing to escape the close-range engagement. But Sarah anticipated the maneuver and positioned herself to maintain offensive advantage. Her next attack approach used a technique from Soviet fighter manuals that exploited the blind spots in Western aircraft design. The maneuver required flying closer to Williams' aircraft than safety regulations normally allowed, but it positioned her for a conclusive weapons lock. "Phoenix has tone," Sarah announced as her simulated missile acquired Williams' aircraft. "Kill, kill, kill." The exercise concluded with Williams in a defensive position that would have been fatal in actual combat. Thompson's chase plane moved closer to both aircraft, recording their positions for the debrief that would analyze every aspect of the engagement. Sarah had achieved victory using tactics that none of the instructors had expected, demonstrating capabilities that weren't part of the standard Top Gun curriculum. As both aircraft returned to their assigned altitudes and headings, Williams' radio transmission carried the bewildered tone of someone whose assumptions had been challenged by reality. "Phoenix, where did you learn those maneuvers? That wasn't standard Navy BFM." Sarah's response was carefully neutral, avoiding any suggestion that she'd deliberately violated established procedures. "Combat experience teaches adaptation when conditions change, sharpshooter. Sometimes old techniques work better than new ones." But the real significance of the engagement wouldn't become clear until the debrief, when Thompson and his fellow instructors would analyze footage that showed a pilot using techniques they didn't recognize to defeat tactics they'd spent years perfecting. Sarah had proven that her unconventional knowledge provided advantages that couldn't be achieved through standard training alone. The weather system continued building as both aircraft headed back toward Miramar, with thunderstorms creating the kind of challenging conditions that would test every pilot's skills throughout the remaining training schedule. Sarah had demonstrated that she could adapt to circumstances that exceeded the parameters of classroom instruction, but her victory would raise questions about whether individual excellence was compatible with institutional conformity. Williams maintained radio silence during the return flight, processing the reality that he'd been defeated by a pilot whose methods contradicted everything he'd been taught about modern air combat. Sarah flew information beside him, carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd proven that preserved knowledge retained its value regardless of technological advancement. The real test would come in the debrief room, where her tactics would be analyzed by instructors who'd never seen techniques that predated their own training. Sarah had won the first round, but the institutional response would determine whether her approach would be accepted or eliminated from the program that was supposed to identify the Navy's most capable pilots. The debrief room fell silent as the final frames of gun camera footage froze on the wall-mounted display. 23 elite pilots stared at video evidence that contradicted everything they'd been taught about modern air combat. Sarah's aircraft appeared in impossible positions, executing maneuvers that seemed to violate basic physics while systematically dismantling Williams' textbook defensive tactics. Commander Thompson stood at the front of the room, laser pointer motionless in his hand as he processed what he'd just witnessed. His expression shifted between professional analysis and genuine bewilderment, the look of an instructor confronting tactics that weren't covered in any manual he'd ever studied. Behind him, the tactical display showed flight paths that resembled modern art more than conventional BFM patterns. "Phoenix," Thompson began slowly, "explain the energy management principles behind this maneuver sequence." His pointer indicated a section of video showing Sarah's aircraft in a climbing spiral that should have bled airspeed dangerously, yet somehow maintained offensive capability throughout the engagement. Sarah stood at her assigned position along the wall, feeling the weight of 23 pairs of eyes analyzing her every word. "Sir, when weather degrades sensor performance, close-range maneuvering becomes more effective than beyond visual range tactics. The climbing spiral maintains energy while exploiting the opponent's defensive positioning." "Lieutenant Commander." Blade Johnson raised his hand, his voice carrying the sharp interest of someone who'd recognize something significant. "Phoenix, that climbing spiral isn't in any Navy training manual I've seen. Where did you learn that technique?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a controlled burn. Sarah had anticipated this moment since arriving at Top Gun, knowing that eventually her unconventional methods would attract scrutiny from pilots whose careers depended on understanding every tactical advantage available to naval aviators. "Historical research, sir," Sarah replied carefully. "Combat reports from pilots who faced similar conditions during previous conflicts." Lieutenant Lightning Peterson leaned forward in his chair, studying the tactical display with intense concentration. Which conflicts? I mean, this looks like something from a completely different era of air combat. Thompson rewound the video to show Sarah's initial descent maneuver, the aggressive dive that had positioned her below the weather interference while maintaining offensive capability. This diving attack profile appears to deliberately violate several safety parameters. Phoenix, explain your decision-making process. Sarah understood that her response would either legitimize her methods or mark her as a pilot who took unacceptable risks. The institutional culture of Top Gun emphasized procedural adherence and risk mitigation, values that conflicted with the adaptive thinking that had kept her alive during combat deployments. Sir, the aircraft's actual performance envelope exceeds published limitations when conditions require maximum capability. Combat experience taught me that conservative parameters are designed for peacetime training, not survival situations. The admission created a ripple of conversation throughout the room. Several pilots exchanged glances that suggested they were processing information that challenged fundamental assumptions about aircraft capabilities and operational procedures. Sarah had essentially admitted to regularly exceeding safety limits, but other pilots considered inviolable. Williams, who'd remained silent since the engagement, finally spoke up from his position in the front row. Phoenix, that energy management technique you used in the final attack sequence, I've never seen anything like it. How did you calculate the timing without computer assistance? The question revealed more than Williams probably intended. He'd recognized that Sarah's maneuvers required complex calculations that modern pilots typically relied on automated systems to perform. Her ability to execute these techniques manually suggested knowledge that predated digital flight controls. Mental arithmetic, sir, Sarah replied. Energy management principles haven't changed since World War II. The math is the same whether you're flying a P-51 or a Super Hornet. Squadron Leader Morrison, visiting from the Royal Air Force Exchange Program, spoke up with unmistakable British precision. Phoenix, those defensive maneuvers you employed, they're reminiscent of tactics used by RAF pilots during the Battle of Britain. Have you studied historical combat reports from that period? Sarah felt the attention in the room shift from skeptical analysis to genuine curiosity. Morrison's question suggested recognition rather than criticism, the acknowledgement of one professional recognizing another's expertise. Yes, sir. I've studied combat reports from multiple conflicts, looking for techniques that remain valid regardless of technological advancement. Lieutenant Thunder Peterson raised his hand with obvious excitement. Phoenix, do you have access to these historical reports? I mean, could other pilots learn these techniques? The question represented a fundamental shift in the room's dynamics. Instead of questioning Sarah's deviation from standard procedures, pilots were beginning to recognize potential value in her unconventional methods. Thompson's expression suggested he was processing implications that extended far beyond a single training exercise. Peterson, let's focus on analyzing today's engagement before exploring broader training applications, Thompson said, but his tone lacked the dismissive authority he'd displayed in previous briefings. The gun camera footage had provided evidence that couldn't be ignored or explained away. Through institutional bias. Captain Viper Adams, the senior instructor who'd been observing silently from the back of the room, approached the tactical display. With measured steps, his reputation for tactical innovation had made him a legend among Navy pilots, and his opinion carried weight that could legitimize or condemn Sarah's methods. Phoenix, Adams said quietly, this vertical maneuvering sequence demonstrates understanding of aircraft performance characteristics that exceeds what we typically expect from fleet pilots. How long have you been developing these techniques? Sarah recognized the significance of Adams' question. Unlike Thompson's focus on procedural compliance, Adams was asking about the development process that had led to her tactical innovations. His interest suggested professional recognition rather than disciplinary concern. 8 years, sir. Combat deployments in Afghanistan provided opportunities to test techniques under actual combat conditions. Equipment failures and adverse weather forced adaptation beyond standard procedures. The admission that Sarah had been developing and testing unauthorized tactics during combat deployments created another moment of silence in the room. Several pilots began taking notes, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in their experience of military aviation training. Lieutenant Commander Ice Martinez, who'd been silent throughout the debrief, finally spoke up with obvious respect in his voice. "Phoenix, that final attack approach, you positioned yourself in Williams' blind spot while maintaining offensive capability. I've never seen that combination executed so precisely." Williams nodded reluctantly, professional integrity overcoming personal embarrassment. "She's right, Ice. I couldn't track her position while maintaining defensive maneuvering. It was like fighting an opponent who understood my aircraft's limitations better than I did." The acknowledgement from Williams represented a significant moment in Sarah's Top Gun experience. The pilot who'd initially questioned her qualifications was now providing testimony to her tactical superiority. Other pilots began asking detailed questions about specific maneuvers, energy management calculations, and historical precedents for techniques they'd never encountered. Thompson realized that the debrief had evolved beyond analyzing a single engagement into something approaching an impromptu educational seminar. Pilots were requesting clarification on techniques that weren't covered in official training materials, seeking knowledge that could enhance their own tactical capabilities. "Phoenix," Thompson said finally, "I want you to prepare a detailed briefing on these energy management techniques for presentation to the instructor staff. We need to understand the theoretical foundation behind what we observed today." The request represented official recognition that Sarah's methods deserved serious analysis rather than dismissal. For the first time since arriving at Top Gun, she was being asked to share her knowledge rather than simply conform to established procedures. Lieutenant Siren Kim approached Sarah after the debrief concluded, her expression mixing admiration with professional curiosity. "Phoenix, would you be willing to discuss some of these techniques privately? I think there are applications for electronic warfare scenarios that we haven't explored." Similar requests came from other pilots as the room emptied. Lieutenant Peterson wanted to understand the historical research methods that had led to Sarah's tactical innovations. Captain Adams requested copies of the combat reports that had influenced her development of unconventional maneuvering techniques. As Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to leave, she realized that the dynamics of her Top Gun experience had fundamentally changed. Instead of being the diversity hire who didn't belong, she was becoming the pilot who possessed knowledge that others wanted to acquire. The whispered conversations that had once questioned her qualifications now focused on learning from her expertise. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The invisible pilot was becoming visible not through institutional recognition or political correctness, but through demonstrated capability that couldn't be ignored or explained away. Her unconventional methods had proven their worth in the most direct way possible, by achieving victory against a superior opponent using tactics that others hadn't understood. But recognition brought new challenges. Official interest in her techniques would subject them to analysis by instructors who might not appreciate the adaptive thinking that had made them effective. The question now was whether her preserved knowledge could survive the scrutiny of an institution that valued conformity over innovation. The summons arrived at 800 hours the following morning, delivered by a junior officer whose expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else than serving as a messenger between conflicting levels of command. Sarah read the official memorandum twice before fully comprehending its implications. Report to Captain Mitchell Reynolds, Deputy Commander Naval Fighter Weapons School, for immediate consultation regarding unauthorized tactical procedures. Captain. Reynolds' office occupied the corner of the administration building with windows offering panoramic views of the flight, line and training facilities. The walls displayed photographs spanning 3 decades of naval aviation history, showing Reynolds in various aircraft and combat deployments that had established his reputation as both an exceptional pilot and an institutional guardian. His desk was organized with military precision, bearing only essential documents and a coffee cup that suggested he'd been reviewing Sarah's case since before dawn. Commander Martinez, Reynolds began without preamble, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. I've reviewed the gun camera footage from yesterday's training exercise. Your performance raises serious concerns about adherence to established safety protocols and training standardization. Sarah maintained rigid attention while processing the implications of Reynolds' opening statement. The focus on safety protocols and standardization suggested institutional priorities that valued conformity over tactical innovation. Her demonstration of superior combat capability was being reframed as a discipline problem rather than a training opportunity. Sir, I maintained aircraft control throughout the engagement and achieved the assigned training objectives, Sarah replied carefully. All maneuvers remained within the aircraft's actual performance envelope. Reynolds opened a thick folder containing technical reports and safety analyses that had apparently been prepared overnight by his staff. Commander, your flight profile exceeded published G-force limitations by 15% and included diving maneuvers that violated altitude restrictions established for this training area. The criticism revealed the institutional mindset that Sarah had encountered throughout her Navy career. Reynolds was evaluating her performance against peacetime training parameters rather than combat effectiveness criteria. His concern focused on rule compliance rather than tactical superiority, reflecting an organizational culture that prioritized risk avoidance over mission accomplishment. Sir, those limitations are established for normal training scenarios, Sarah explained. When weather conditions degrade sensor performance, close-range maneuvering becomes necessary for effective engagement. Reynolds' expression hardened slightly, suggesting that Sarah's explanation was being interpreted as justification for insubordination rather than tactical adaptation. Commander, Top Gun exists to teach standardized procedures that can be implemented fleet-wide. Individual pilots cannot be permitted to modify established doctrine based on personal preferences. The phrase personal preferences struck Sarah as particularly insulting. Her tactical innovations had been developed through 8 years of combat experience, where survival depended on adapting to conditions that exceeded the parameters of classroom instruction. Reynolds was reducing proven combat techniques to matters of individual choice rather than recognizing them as professional expertise. Sir, I respectfully disagree, Sarah said, knowing that her response would be viewed as further evidence of unwillingness to conform. Combat experience has taught me that rigid adherence to procedures can be fatal when conditions require adaptation. Reynolds closed the folder with deliberate precision, his gesture suggesting that the discussion was moving beyond technical analysis into questions of military discipline and chain of command authority. Commander Martinez, let me be absolutely clear about something. This institution has produced thousands of exceptional naval aviators using proven training methods. We don't modify our curriculum based on the tactical theories of individual pilots. The dismissal of her combat experience as tactical theories revealed the fundamental disconnect between institutional thinking and operational reality. Reynolds represented a command structure that valued theoretical perfection over practical effectiveness, preferring predictable mediocrity to innovative excellence. "Sir, I understand the importance of standardization," Sarah replied. "But yesterday's engagement demonstrated that alternative approaches can be more effective under certain conditions." Reynolds stood and walked to his window, looking out over the flight line where Super Hornets sat in perfect formation under the California sun. His posture suggested the weight of command responsibility that included maintaining institutional integrity against challenges from subordinates who might not understand broader organizational requirements. "Commander, you're missing the larger picture," Reynolds said without turning around. Top Gun graduates return to their squadrons as instructors responsible for training junior pilots. If we allow individual innovation here, we create inconsistencies that compromise fleet-wide tactical effectiveness. Sarah recognized the logic behind Reynolds' position, but she also understood that his reasoning assumed conditions that rarely existed in actual combat. The standardization he valued was designed for controlled environments where equipment functioned perfectly and enemies behaved predictably. Her experience had taught her that real warfare required adaptation to circumstances that training scenarios couldn't anticipate. "Sir, wouldn't tactical flexibility enhance fleet effectiveness rather than compromise it?" Sarah asked. "Pilots who understand multiple approaches can adapt to changing conditions more effectively than those trained in single methods." Reynolds turned back to face her, his expression carrying the patient tolerance of someone explaining basic concepts to a subordinate who'd failed to grasp essential principles. "Commander, military effectiveness depends on predictable execution of established procedures. When pilots start improvising, coordination breaks down and casualties increase." The argument reflected institutional wisdom that Sarah had encountered throughout her career, but her combat experience had taught her that the opposite was often true. Rigid adherence to procedures had caused more casualties than tactical innovation in every conflict she'd studied. The most effective pilots throughout history had been those who understood both established doctrine and alternative approaches. "Sir, I've reviewed historical combat reports that suggest flexibility improves survival rates," Sarah said, knowing that her persistence was probably being interpreted as insubordination. "Pilots who can adapt to unexpected conditions are more likely to complete missions successfully." Reynolds returned to his desk and opened another folder containing what appeared to be personnel evaluations and career recommendations. "Commander Martinez, your record shows exceptional technical proficiency and dedication to duty. However, your unwillingness to conform to institutional standards raises questions about your suitability for advanced training programs." The threat was delivered with professional courtesy, but its implications were unmistakable. "Continue challenging established procedures and face elimination from Top Gun, with career consequences that would effectively end her advancement opportunities." The institutional response to tactical innovation was to eliminate the innovator rather than evaluate the innovation. "Sir, I'm committed to completing the program successfully," Sarah replied, understanding that her response would be interpreted as capitulation to institutional authority. Reynolds' expression softened slightly, suggesting that he viewed her statement as evidence of returning to acceptable patterns of military subordination. "Commander, you have exceptional flying skills that could benefit the fleet if properly channeled. I'm recommending that you work closely with Commander Thompson to ensure your techniques align with standard Navy doctrine." The recommendation represented a compromise that would allow Sarah to complete Top Gun while requiring her to abandon the tactical innovations that had demonstrated superior effectiveness. Reynolds was offering career survival in exchange for intellectual conformity, a bargain that reflected institutional priorities more clearly than any policy manual. "Understood, sir," Sarah said, recognizing that further argument would only strengthen Reynolds' conviction that she represented a threat to organizational stability. As Sarah left Reynolds' office, she carried with her the understanding that her tactical innovations had been officially classified as problems to be solved, rather than assets to be developed. The institutional response to her demonstrated superiority was to suppress rather than study her methods, reflecting an organizational culture that valued conformity over excellence. The corridor outside Reynolds' office buzzed with activity as staff officers processed the daily requirements of running the Navy's most prestigious training program. Sarah walked past them toward the flight line, understanding that her position at Top Gun had fundamentally changed. She was no longer the diversity hire struggling to prove her worth, but she wasn't yet the recognized expert whose knowledge was valued by institutional leadership. Instead, she occupied an uncomfortable middle ground where her capabilities were acknowledged, but her methods were considered threatening to organizational stability. The challenge now was to continue developing her tactical innovations while avoiding further confrontation with institutional authority that could end her career. The invisible pilot had become visible through demonstrated excellence, but visibility brought scrutiny that could be more dangerous than obscurity. Sarah understood that her next moves would determine whether her preserved knowledge could survive the institutional pressure to conform, or whether she would be forced to abandon the tactical innovations that had proven their worth in combat. Second week of training began with an announcement that would change everything. Commander Thompson stood before the assembled pilots with an expression that mixed professional duty with personal reluctance, reading from official orders that had arrived from Washington overnight. Due to increased tensions in the South China Sea, Top Gun will be conducting evaluation exercises using electronic warfare scenarios that simulate advanced threat environments. Sarah recognized the implications immediately. Electronic warfare conditions would degrade the sophisticated sensor systems that modern Navy doctrine relied upon, creating exactly the circumstances where her unconventional methods provided decisive advantages. The institutional preference for beyond visual range tactics would be neutralized by jamming that forced close-range engagements. Lieutenant Razor Williams approached her during the pre-flight briefing, his earlier skepticism replaced by genuine curiosity about techniques he'd witnessed but couldn't replicate. "Phoenix, yesterday's engagement got me thinking about energy management principles. Would you be willing to explain how you calculate optimal climb rates without computer assistance?" The request represented a fundamental shift in the dynamics surrounding Sarah's presence at Top Gun. Instead of questioning her qualifications, pilots were beginning to recognize that her knowledge filled gaps in their own tactical education. Williams' interest reflected growing awareness that combat effectiveness required more than technological superiority. "It's about understanding your aircraft's actual capabilities versus published limitations," Sarah explained while reviewing mission parameters. "The computers calculate conservative values designed for peacetime operations. Combat requires knowing when to exceed those boundaries safely." Other pilots gathered around their conversation, forming an impromptu study group that would have been impossible during Sarah's first week at Top Gun. Lieutenant Thunder Peterson took notes while Sarah sketched energy management diagrams on a napkin, showing how aircraft performance could be optimized through techniques that predated digital flight controls. "This is incredible," Peterson said, studying the hand-drawn calculations. "You're essentially flying the aircraft manually while others rely on computer recommendations. That's a huge advantage when electronic systems fail." The morning's first exercise paired Sarah with Lieutenant Commander Ice Martinez, a pilot whose reputation for precision flying had earned him respect throughout the program. Unlike Williams' aggressive approach, Martinez favored methodical tactics that maximize technological advantages while minimizing risk. His flying style represented everything that Navy doctrine considered ideal, but when their Super Hornets entered the electronic warfare environment, Martinez discovered that his sophisticated systems were degraded to the point where standard procedures became ineffective. His radar display showed false returns generated by enemy jamming, while his weapon systems struggled to maintain target locks against opponents using electronic countermeasures. "Phoenix, my sensors are giving me garbage," Martinez reported. Over the radio, "I can't get a clean lock on anything beyond 10 miles. Sarah's response would have surprised her instructors if they'd been monitoring her radio transmissions. Instead of offering sympathy or requesting mission abort, she began coaching Martinez through adaptation techniques that transformed electronic warfare from a disadvantage into a tactical opportunity. Ice, drop to 8,000 feet and use terrain masking to avoid their jamming. Sarah instructed while maneuvering her own aircraft to demonstrate the technique. Your radar will work better at low altitude where ground clutter provides natural screening. The suggestion violated established doctrine that emphasized altitude advantages for sensor performance. But Martinez was desperate enough to try anything that might restore his tactical effectiveness. He followed Sarah's guidance, discovering that his radar performance improved dramatically when operated below the altitude bands where enemy jamming was most effective. "Phoenix, how did you know that would work?" Martinez asked as his systems began, providing actionable intelligence for the first time since entering the electronic warfare environment. Sarah's explanation revealed knowledge that her instructors had never encountered during their own training. Electronic warfare operates on line-of-sight principles. Enemy jammers positioned at high altitude can't affect low-level radar operations if you use terrain features properly. The principle was fundamental to electronic warfare theory, but it had been obscured by institutional focus on high-altitude operations that maximize the effectiveness of modern sensor systems. Sarah's combat experience had taught her to operate in environments where electronic warfare was a constant threat rather than a theoretical possibility. As the exercise continued, Martinez began achieving weapons locks that would have been impossible using standard high-altitude procedures. His aircraft's performance improved so dramatically that other pilots began requesting similar coaching from Sarah, recognizing that her techniques provided capabilities they couldn't achieve through conventional training. Lieutenant Blade Johnson, monitoring the exercise from his own aircraft, made an observation that would later appear in official after-action reports. "Phoenix, your tactical innovations are giving us capabilities that our training didn't prepare us for. These techniques should be part of the standard curriculum." The comment represented institutional recognition that Sarah's methods provided quantifiable advantages over established procedures. Johnson's recommendation would carry weight with instructors who valued tactical effectiveness over procedural conformity, creating momentum for broader acceptance of her innovations. Captain Viper Adams, observing from the chase plane, began recording detailed notes about Sarah's techniques for later analysis by the Top Gun instructional staff. His interest reflected growing awareness that her methods addressed gaps in current training that had been exposed by the electronic warfare scenarios. "Phoenix, your terrain masking technique is allowing pilots to operate effectively in environments where standard procedures fail," Adams observed during a brief radio conversation. "This represents a significant tactical advantage that we need to understand better." The exercise concluded with results that couldn't be ignored by institutional leadership. Pilots working with Sarah achieved weapons employment success rates that exceeded those of pilots using conventional techniques by margins that were statistically significant. The electronic warfare environment had provided objective conditions for comparing tactical approaches. During the post-flight debrief, Commander Thompson found himself analyzing data that contradicted fundamental assumptions about modern air combat. Pilots using Sarah's techniques had achieved mission success rates approaching 90%, while those relying solely on conventional training struggled to exceed 60% effectiveness. "Phoenix, these results suggest that your techniques provide measurable advantages under electronic warfare conditions," Thompson admitted reluctantly. "We need to understand how these methods can be integrated into our standard training curriculum." The acknowledgement represented the beginning of institutional acceptance that Sarah's knowledge deserved serious consideration rather than dismissive tolerance. Thompson's statement reflected growing awareness that combat effectiveness required adaptation beyond the boundaries of established doctrine. Lieutenant Siren Kim approached Sarah after the formal debrief, carrying detailed notes about the techniques she'd observed during the exercise. "Phoenix, I've been analyzing your electronic warfare countermeasures. They're based on principles that aren't covered in our training materials, but appear to be more effective than anything we're currently teaching." Kim's analysis would later form the foundation for proposals to modify Top Gun curriculum to include techniques that Sarah had preserved from historical combat experience. Her technical documentation provided the institutional evidence needed to support broader acceptance of unconventional methods. As the day's training concluded, Sarah found herself surrounded by pilots requesting individual instruction in techniques that had proven their worth under conditions that closely resembled actual combat scenarios. The invisible pilot who'd been dismissed as a diversity hire was becoming the most sought-after instructor at the Navy's most prestigious training program, but institutional change moved slowly, and Sarah understood that her growing influence would continue to generate resistance from authority figures who viewed innovation as a threat to organizational stability. The challenge was to build momentum for broader acceptance while avoiding confrontation with leadership that could end her career. The validation had begun, but the real test would come when institutional leadership decided whether to embrace tactical innovation or suppress it to maintain existing power structures. Sarah had proven that her methods worked, but proving their worth and gaining official acceptance remained separate challenges that would determine the future of naval aviation training. The unofficial training sessions began 3 days later, in an abandoned classroom at the far end of the academic building, where Sarah found herself facing 12 elite pilots who'd voluntarily sacrificed their evening liberty to learn techniques that weren't part of the official curriculum. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead while she arranged historical combat reports and tactical diagrams across several tables, creating an impromptu learning environment that felt more like a graduate seminar than military instruction. Lieutenant Thunder Peterson arrived first, carrying a notebook filled with questions that had accumulated since watching Sarah's electronic warfare demonstrations. Behind him came Lieutenant Commander Ice Martinez, whose tactical success during the jamming exercise had convinced him that conventional training had significant gaps. Captain Blade Johnson followed, bringing copies of technical manuals that he'd been comparing with Sarah's historical references. "What you're about to learn isn't classified information," Sarah began, addressing the group with the quiet authority of someone who'd earned credibility through demonstrated results. "These techniques were developed by pilots who faced conditions similar to what we encounter in modern electronic warfare environments. The knowledge was systematically removed from training curricula as technology advanced, but the fundamental principles remain valid." She opened a binder containing Israeli Air Force combat reports from the 1973 Yom Kippur War, spreading photographs and tactical diagrams across the table where everyone could examine them. The images showed F-4 Phantom jets in combat configurations that emphasized close-range maneuvering over beyond visual range missile employment. Israeli pilots discovered that sophisticated weapon systems could be neutralized by electronic countermeasures and equipment failures, Sarah explained while pointing to specific engagement sequences. When their advanced missiles failed, they reverted to gun attacks that required energy management techniques similar to World War II fighter combat. Lieutenant Siren Kim studied the tactical diagrams with intense concentration, recognizing implications that extended beyond historical curiosity. "Phoenix, these energy management principles could revolutionize how we approach electronic warfare scenarios. Modern pilots aren't trained to calculate optimal attack angles manually." The observation reflected growing awareness among Sarah's students that their technological sophistication had created intellectual dependencies that became liabilities when sophisticated systems failed. Kim's analysis would later influence proposals to modify Top Gun curriculum to include manual calculation, techniques that had been abandoned during the transition to computer-assisted flight controls. Sarah moved to the next historical example, displaying gun camera footage from Royal Air Force pilots during the Falklands War. The black and white images showed British Harrier jets engaging Argentine aircraft under conditions where weather and enemy jamming had degraded sensor performance to levels that forced close-range combat. British pilots adapted to electronic warfare by using terrain masking techniques that exploited the geographic characteristics of the Falkland Islands. Sarah continued, narrating footage that showed aircraft maneuvering at altitudes that violated standard safety protocols. They discovered that low-level flight provided natural screening against enemy radar while maintaining offensive capability. Captain Johnson raised his hand, his expression reflecting the analytical thinking that had made him one of Top Gun's most respected graduates. Phoenix, this terrain masking concept explains why your techniques were so effective during our electronic warfare exercise. You were applying lessons learned from actual combat rather than theoretical scenarios. The recognition represented a breakthrough in institutional understanding that Sarah's methods weren't improvisations, but applications of proven combat experience. Johnson's endorsement would carry significant weight with instructors who valued tactical effectiveness over procedural conformity. As the evening progressed, Sarah guided her students through practical exercises that translated historical techniques into modern applications. Using hand-drawn diagrams and mental calculations, she demonstrated how energy management principles from the 1940s could be adapted to F/A-18 Super Hornet performance characteristics. Calculate your optimal climb rate using engine thrust specifications and aircraft weight. Sarah instructed while writing equations on a whiteboard that hadn't been used for this purpose in years. The computers give you conservative recommendations, designed for peacetime operations. Combat requires understanding when to exceed those limitations safely. Lieutenant Peterson worked through the calculations with increasing confidence, discovering that manual computation provided insights that automated systems couldn't offer. Phoenix, this mathematical approach gives me understanding of aircraft performance that I've never had before. I can predict optimal maneuvering techniques instead of just following computer recommendations. The educational process continued, with practical demonstrations of visual recognition techniques that allowed pilots to identify aircraft types and configurations at distances where electronic identification systems might fail. Sarah had memorized aircraft silhouettes and performance characteristics for every major military aircraft in the world, knowledge that proved invaluable when sophisticated sensors provided unreliable information. Electronic warfare environments force pilots to rely on visual identification skills that haven't been emphasized in modern training. Sarah explained while displaying aircraft recognition cards that resembled materials from the Cold War era. When your radar shows false returns, you need to distinguish between friendly and enemy aircraft using techniques that predate digital technology. Lieutenant Martinez practiced the visual recognition exercises with methodical precision, understanding that these skills could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic friendly fire incidents. His dedication to mastering techniques that weren't part of official training reflected the growing commitment among Sarah's students to comprehensive tactical education. The most significant breakthrough came when Sarah introduced formation flying, techniques that maximize tactical coordination while minimizing electronic signatures that enemy sensors could detect. The methods required pilots to maintain precise positioning using visual references rather than digital data links, creating formations that were both more effective and less vulnerable to electronic countermeasures. Traditional formation flying emphasized individual aircraft performance. Sarah explained while demonstrating hand signals that allowed silent communication between pilots. Modern formations should function as integrated weapon systems that can operate effectively when Electronic communication fails. Captain Adams arrived during the final hour of the session, having been drawn by reports of unauthorized training activities that were generating enthusiastic responses from participating pilots. Instead of ending the session, he observed quietly from the back of the room, taking notes about techniques that weren't covered in the official Top Gun curriculum. Phoenix, these formation techniques address tactical gaps that we've identified in recent fleet exercises, Adams observed after watching Sarah demonstrate silent communication procedures. Electronic warfare scenarios have repeatedly shown that our current training doesn't prepare pilots for operations without digital communication systems. The endorsement from Adams provided institutional validation that Sarah's teaching activities aligned with broader Navy tactical requirements. His support would be crucial for gaining official acceptance of techniques that had been developed outside the formal training pipeline. As the session concluded, Sarah's students began making plans for continuing their education in techniques that weren't available through conventional military instruction. Lieutenant Kim volunteered to research electronic warfare countermeasures that could be integrated with Sarah's terrain masking techniques. Captain Johnson offered to develop mathematical models that would formalize the energy management principles they discussed. Phoenix, this knowledge is too valuable to remain confined to informal study groups, Peterson observed while gathering his notes. These techniques should be part of standard pilot training throughout the fleet. The comment reflected growing awareness that Sarah's preserved knowledge addressed fundamental gaps in modern naval aviation training. Her students were becoming advocates for broader institutional change that would incorporate historical wisdom into contemporary tactical education. But Sarah understood that transformation required more than enthusiastic support from individual pilots. Institutional change demanded evidence that convinced leadership to modify established procedures, documentation that proved the effectiveness of unconventional methods, and political support from authority figures who could overcome resistance to innovation. The informal classroom had become the foundation for a quiet revolution in naval aviation training, where knowledge that had been dismissed as obsolete was proving its continued relevance in modern combat scenarios. Sarah's role had evolved from proving her individual worth to developing the next generation of tactically sophisticated pilots who understood both historical principles and contemporary applications. The invisible pilot had become a teacher whose influence would extend far beyond her individual achievements, creating a network of skilled aviators who carried forward knowledge that institutional memory had nearly lost forever. 2 years later, Sarah stood before an audience of 300 naval aviators from 17 nations, assembled in the main auditorium of the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. The amphitheater buzzed with conversations in multiple languages as pilots compared notes on tactical innovations that had revolutionized air combat training across the globe. Behind her, a massive projection screen displayed the insignia of the International Combat Aviation Training Initiative, a program that had emerged from her informal classroom sessions at Top Gun. The transformation had begun 6 months after her Top Gun graduation. When Admiral Patricia Richardson received combat reports from 3 different theaters showing that pilots trained in Sarah's techniques were achieving mission success rates that exceeded conventional training by margins that could not be ignored. Fleet commanders from the Mediterranean, Pacific, and Arabian Gulf had independently requested access to instructors who could teach the energy management and electronic warfare countermeasures that were producing such dramatic results. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had earned credibility through demonstrated results rather than institutional position. 3 years ago, most of you had never heard of manual energy management calculations or terrain masking techniques for electronic warfare environments. Today, these methods are standard training for pilots in 19 countries and counting. The audience included pilots who had initially dismissed her as a diversity hire, officers who had become her most dedicated students, and international colleagues who had implemented her techniques in their own training programs. Admiral Richardson sat in the front row, wearing the expression of someone who had made a career-defining decision to support innovation over institutional conservatism. The statistical evidence displayed on the projection screen told a story that validated every risk Sarah had taken during her journey from invisible observer to recognized expert. Pilot survival rates in electronic warfare environments had improved by 37%. Mission success rates during equipment failures had increased by 42%. Most significantly, the techniques had prevented 14 documented incidents where technological failures could have resulted in casualties or international diplomatic crises. The fundamental lesson we've learned, Sarah continued, is that preserved knowledge doesn't become worthless just because it's old. The energy management principles that saved Israeli pilots in 1973 remain valid for F-35 Lightning aircraft in 2024. The terrain masking techniques developed during the Falklands War provide decisive advantages in modern electronic warfare scenarios. Captain Marcus Webb, who had evolved from skeptical instructor to program advocate, stood to address the audience from his position near the podium. Commander Martinez has revolutionized how we think about pilot training by demonstrating that historical knowledge and modern technology create synergistic effects that exceed the capabilities of either approach alone. The endorsement represented complete institutional transformation from the dismissive attitudes that had characterized Sarah's early Top Gun experience. Webb's support reflected growing awareness throughout the naval aviation community that tactical innovation required understanding both contemporary capabilities and fundamental principles that transcended technological generations. Lieutenant Commander Jennifer Kim, now serving as Deputy Director of the International Program, approached the podium to present data that documented the global impact of Sarah's educational initiatives. The manual calculation techniques that Commander Martinez preserved from World War II. Combat reports have been adapted for use with 17 different aircraft types across multiple Allied nations. Pilots who master these methods demonstrate 40% better performance in scenarios where computer systems fail. The presentation included testimonials from pilots who had used Sarah's techniques in actual combat operations. A Royal Navy aviator described using terrain masking to avoid surface-to-air missiles during operations off the coast of Syria. A Japanese self-defense force pilot explained how energy management calculations had enabled him to outmaneuver more advanced aircraft during a simulated engagement. An Australian pilot credited visual recognition techniques with preventing a friendly fire incident during joint operations in the South Pacific. Admiral Richardson rose to address the audience, her presence commanding immediate attention from officers who understood that her endorsement had made the entire program possible. Commander Martinez began this journey as a pilot whose knowledge was dismissed as obsolete. Today, she has transformed how 300,000 military aviators understand the relationship between historical wisdom and contemporary capabilities. The Admiral's words reflected institutional recognition that extended far beyond individual achievement. Sarah's preserved knowledge had become the foundation for training programs that would influence pilot development for generations, creating a legacy that transcended her personal career advancement. Colonel James Morrison, representing the Royal Air Force, stood to announce that the British government had formally adopted Sarah's techniques as standard training for all RAF pilots. The energy management principles that Commander Martinez preserved from historical combat reports have proven more effective than any tactical innovation we've implemented in the past decade. Similar announcements followed from representatives of Allied nations who had integrated Sarah's methods into their own training curricula. The French Air Force had modified their electronic warfare training to include terrain masking techniques. The German Luftwaffe had implemented manual calculation. Requirements for all pilot certification programs. The Canadian Forces had adopted visual recognition training based on materials that Sarah had preserved from Cold War archives. As the formal presentation concluded, Sarah found herself surrounded by pilots from around the world who wanted to share their experiences with techniques that had enhanced their tactical capabilities. A Swedish pilot described using energy management principles to defeat Russian aircraft during Baltic Sea patrol missions. An Italian aviator explained how terrain masking had enabled successful operations in mountainous terrain where conventional tactics failed. But the most meaningful recognition came from a young ensign who approached Sarah with obvious nervousness, carrying a flight manual that looked remarkably similar to the historical binders she had studied during her early Top Gun days. "Commander Martinez, I wanted to thank you for preserving this knowledge. I'm about to deploy to my first combat assignment, and I feel prepared for situations that might have killed pilots who only knew conventional procedures." The ensign's gratitude represented the ultimate validation of Sarah's efforts to preserve and transmit tactical knowledge that institutional memory had nearly lost. Her work had created a generation of pilots who understood both modern capabilities and fundamental principles, aviators who could adapt to changing conditions rather than failing when technology didn't perform as expected. Evening fell over Newport. As Sarah walked along the waterfront, reflecting on the journey that had brought her from the back row of a Top Gun briefing room to the podium of an international military conference. The harbor lights reflected off the water while naval vessels from multiple nations rode at anchor, their crews representing the global community that had embraced her tactical innovations. Her phone buzzed with messages from former students who had become instructors themselves, spreading knowledge that would continue evolving as new generations of pilots adapted historical principles to emerging technologies. Lieutenant Peterson had been selected to establish a training program for F-35 pilots, using energy management techniques that Sarah had preserved from World War II combat reports. Captain Johnson was developing electronic warfare countermeasures based on terrain masking principles that had proven effective during the Falklands War. The transformation was complete, but Sarah understood that her legacy would continue growing through the students who had become teachers, the techniques that had become doctrine, and the preserved knowledge that would guide future generations of pilots facing challenges that couldn't be anticipated or programmed into the most sophisticated computer systems. The invisible pilot who had been dismissed as a diversity hire had become the architect of a training revolution that would influence military aviation for decades to come. Her preserved knowledge had proven that sometimes the most important innovations came not from looking forward to new technology, but from remembering the fundamental principles that had kept pilots alive when failure meant death rather than embarrassment. Sarah Martinez had started as the pilot nobody noticed, flying in the back with no voice in the formation. She had become the instructor everyone remembered, the officer who taught the world that preserved knowledge was preserved wisdom, and that the oldest lessons often remained the most important ones. The final moment of vindication came during a crisis that no training manual could have predicted. A software glitch in the F-35 Lightning's flight control system had grounded the entire fleet, leaving Navy pilots unable to fly their most advanced aircraft. While engineers worked frantically to develop a software patch, Sarah stood before a room of frustrated aviators with a solution that seemed impossible. "We're going to fly them manually," she announced, pulling out the same binder she'd carried to Top Gun years earlier. "These aircraft have backup systems that work exactly like the planes your grandfathers flew in World War II." Within hours, pilots trained in Sarah's techniques were back in the air, flying billion-dollar fighters using calculations performed with pencil and paper. The crisis that had paralyzed the world's most advanced Air Force became a demonstration of how preserved knowledge could solve problems that cutting-edge technology couldn't. As news cameras captured F-35s taking off using techniques from 1943, Sarah stood on the flight line, watching her students prove that innovation often meant remembering what others had forgotten. The invisible pilot had become unforgettable, not through politics or promotion, but by preserving wisdom that others had discarded. Her legacy would echo through every cockpit, where pilots understood that the most sophisticated computer was still no match for a human mind that had learned to think beyond the limitations of any single system. In the end, Sarah Martinez had done more than outfly every top gun pilot. She had taught them to outthink the machines they flew. What incredible story of overlooked expertise have you witnessed in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of how one person's preserved knowledge transformed an entire military, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We share incredible true stories of underdogs who changed the world through determination and skill. Don't miss our next inspiring tale. Subscribe now and join our community of everyday heroes.